Okay. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this live Q&A of the 2020 changes to the real estate assessment. We already have about 90 people on the line and we're expecting a few more, so thank you all for joining us. My name is Roxana Isayo. I'm the Director of Real Estate at GRESB, and it's certainly a strange time, and it's unfortunate that we had to cancel our in-person trainings, but we are very glad we can interact with so many of you today via this webinar. If you are not on mute and you have some background noise, I would kindly ask that you please mute yourself, and we'll go through some of the Zoom functions in just a bit. I'm not alone today. The entire real estate team is dialing in, and I would like to introduce you all to Charles, Kevin, Christina, Max, Victor, and Eric. Everybody is working from home in Amsterdam, and we agreed not to switch on the camera to ensure good quality sound. But you will hear from a number of different people today, and it's always nice to put a face to a name. So we thought we would start with these three pictures. Plus, now you know who is at the receiving end of all the questions sent via the contact form and the emails that you send or you will send. So please do not hesitate to contact us if you do need additional support. We are here to help, especially during this unusual period for all of us. You will hear from everyone as you go or as we go together through the presentation. So before we get started, a few notes on the Zoom webinar. First of all, I hope everyone was able to join in via the Q&A, to join the Q&A session using the computer. And that's because we are using a few features that aren't available in other dial-in functions. What you see here is circled on the screen are the functions that you should use today. This will please use the Q&A feature instead of the chat feature to ask your questions. This will allow us to sort the questions correctly and answer as many of them as possible in real time. And to keep things simple, we will not check the chat function. So again, please use the Q&A. We want to keep this as dynamic as possible. And so if you'd prefer to simply ask your question live, please raise your hand and we will hand over to you. To that end, there's the functionality circled here. It's just raise hands so we can see you immediately. On today's agenda, we have a few main things. The purpose is obviously to answer as many questions as possible. That's why we call this a live Q&A. And so we'll try to keep our presentation somewhere under 30 minutes and simply use a few slides to get us going as background for the conversation. But we will reserve the better half of this webinar for your questions. We already anticipated some of the things that you would like to address, so we also prepared a few slides on the updated reporting process, the key developments of the assessment, and the implications on output and results. There are, we also prepared a few questions that came in through our help desk over the last couple of weeks. But please use this opportunity to ask your specific questions and get to learn as much as possible to help you start with the reporting process. If there are things very specific that relate to your entity and more complex situations, we can also get back to you afterwards. We do plan to share the results and the answers to the questions that come in via the Q&A separately in writing. And obviously this webinar is recorded and will be shared with you afterwards. So to get things in motion, we actually prepared a short poll. What would GRESB be if not the perfect platform to ask questions? And so right now you should see a poll. You need to scroll to answer all questions. And as everyone is doing that, just launched it. As everyone is doing that, and as everyone is going through the questions, well, one of the things we wanted to know is how is everyone keeping up under the quarantine, and so we wanted to share how we're doing and what we're doing. First of all, We start every morning with a team check-in. So this is us this morning. Thank God for Zoom and other means of digital connection. Apart from that, we try to stay connected on everything that has to do with the tasks of the day, very complex reporting situations. We talk about life in general and really what's new on Netflix. We have to say life in isolation is not boring to anyone yet, but that's because we try to stay very busy. Christina is learning new skills, Charles about the cactus, Eric has already read the greenhouse gas protocol twice. Kevin is teaching us the phrase of the day as one of the very few native speakers on the real estate team. Max decided to move back to Germany, and at least for a while. Victor is playing video games a lot, and I'm cooking unhealthy amounts of pastries. So we all learn something, and we try to make the best of it. And we hope you do the same. So we hope this was a good icebreaker, and to get things going, we see we have a fair amount of answers here, and you've already submitted your input. I'm going to leave it open for another few seconds, and I'm going to end the poll right now. Let's see. It seems like everyone is working from home as expected. That's good. It means everyone is self-isolating, and in general, everyone is trying to stay positive. So that's great. But we do realize that life with children and homeschooling can also have its difficulties. So that seems to be a general available results. You should now see the results yourselves. Yes, thank you. And let's see, who do we have on the line? Most of you haven't completed the training lessons on the 2020 changes just yet. So after this webinar, we would encourage everyone to go to the GRESB website. You need to register an account. Everything is free of charge though. And you'll be able to follow a few training lessons that take you through the GRESB reporting process, the main items on all components, and generally good content that we thought would be very helpful to you to in your reporting process. And obviously, if you still have questions after that, you are more than welcome to contact us, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. And in terms of experience with GRESB, seems like most of you are in your second year. So that means you've successfully completed your grace period and you've returned for the second year. There have been some structural changes in the assessment, but I think you'll recognize most of the questions and most of the content from last year. It is great that you attended today's discussion, and we look forward to your questions. Now, to get started, there was already a question that came in on the timeline, and the question was, will GRESB potentially extend the reporting deadline past August 1st, depending on how COVID-19 progresses? We keep a very close eye on how the situation progresses everywhere. We have an online page where we post updates as we move along. At the moment, we don't know yet if an extension beyond August 1st is needed or necessary, or to what extent that will be necessary. But we will inform everyone of how the timeline will develop towards the end of April. As things stand now, the deadline for submitting the assessment is August 1st. That also means that all the other deadlines have been pushed by a month. So the deadline for the response check has been pushed by 1 month, which is now July 1st. The results will be published 1 month later, but it is very important, and this is one of the main objectives for the team this year, is to make sure that the results will be launched and will be presented to you by the end of the year, so that you can still use them in your engagement with investors, but also in your own processes and to progress for future years. One update in this year's processes compared to previous years has to do with the response check process. If you've participated in GRESB before, you know that you were required to complete the assessment to 100%, so have the entire assessment response completed before you are able to request a response check. That is no longer the case. So everyone can go to the portal right now and request a response check and book a time for the response check already, even if the assessment is only 1% or 5% or 10% completed. And that is because we wanted to facilitate as many calls as possible and to encourage everyone to start their assessment as soon as possible and go to the portal and ensure they have that spot sometime in the reporting process. So please go ahead and do that. Obviously, our recommendation would be to make sure that you have, if not 100% of the assessment completed, at least 90-something% of the response completed a week before your scheduled call to maximize the effect and the use case of the response check. Otherwise, if the team can only review a few of the prepared answers, then you don't get the most out of it. We've listed here the steps needed to do that, and we'll share this presentation with you afterwards, but it is very easy. You just have to go to the portal and you can book it from there. I mentioned there were some structural changes in this year's assessment. We've already communicated and we've already talked a lot about the assessment development process, starting from the moment of the assessment pre-release at the end of last year, all the way to the official assessment launch on April 1st. In case you haven't already seen them, the reference guide as well as the scoring document and a few other relevant resources are available online. These are useful tools in your data collection and data preparation process. And what we would like to emphasize is that this new setup allows a more flexible way of reporting by the different components, but obviously each entity would have to submit the relevant components for their entity, depending on whether they're a standing investments entity or a development portfolio, in order to obtain their overall GRESB score and the overall GRESB rating and the main peer group characteristics and so on. But if you're a first-time participant and you're still not sure whether you'll be able to commit the time, and if you have enough sufficient data and the right type of data to get you started, then please start with the management component. This is a good way to evaluate everything around your ESG strategy and leadership management, policies, stakeholder engagement approaches, whereas the performance component is a collection of indicators at portfolio, at asset level that look at the underlying performance of the operational assets in the portfolio. And then next to that, or in parallel, the development component is a set of indicators that looks at the development projects in an entity. So that's new construction and major renovation projects. And Kevin will talk a bit about that later on today. Just to get you familiar with the portal, this is one of the screens you'll see when you set up your entity. You'll actually be asked to identify the components that you will submit, that you would like to submit. You can always go back and change the selection, so don't worry if you're not really sure at the beginning, or you want to update it afterwards. But this is just one of the first steps when you set up your entity or update your entity in the portal and identify the components that you would like to submit, and therefore you unlock the relevant indicators in each of these components. And so with that, I would like to hand over to Christina to tell us a bit about the management component. Christina?
Hi everyone, I hope you're doing well, and thank you, Roxana, for the introduction. I still haven't run out of new skills to learn, but please, if you have any suggestions, let me know, because I assume that this is going to happen any day now. So more on the management component, there are actually 28 indicators that are structured into 5 aspects. Roxana already went through most of them and the content about them. And also, as she already mentioned, all indicators are addressed at the entity level and address entity level performance, which really makes the components suitable for all real estate entities, regardless of whether they hold any standing investments, whether they participate in development, or whether they're in a beginning capital raising stage. Next slide, please. So the developments or the main changes that we have implemented to the management component have really been kept to a minimum. Most of the indicators that now comprise the management component have remained with the same structure as they used to in previous years and in the previous assessments. Some of the main changes that we have implemented is to add new answer options to some of the indicators, and we have done that mainly for the purpose of increasing alignment, both internally in order to align better with the real estate, with the infrastructure assessment, and to also incorporate some of the frequently reported other options. In addition, we have also aligned externally to other reporting frameworks such as PRI, RobecoSAM, and CDP. We have also conducted a gap analysis with a lot of them, and we have added the gap analysis as an appendix to the reference guide so that you can address that as well and see the level of alignment of different indicators. In addition, we have also highlighted the fact that all indicators refer to the entity level by phrasing them in such a way so all indicators address the entity instead of assets or portfolios. And also bless you. And we have also added titles, and we have aligned again the indicator codes in order to facilitate easy referencing both for participants across different documentations and project teams, as well as across different tools that we have, for example, the data exports tool. And that's it in terms of
Thank you, Christina. If anyone has questions on the management component, please put them in the Q&A and we'll get to them towards the end. Somebody did have a question about first-time participants and whether, so this is a question from a small REIT, they are unsure if the public disclosure is required. And this is, I suppose this is sort of connected to management, but
yes.
Public disclosure is something separate from the real estate assessment. Christina, would you like to elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So the public disclosure assessment is a process that is conducted mainly by the GRESB team, where we collect data on a bunch of different listed companies that cover most of the listed real estate environment worldwide. So if your entity has not been part of the public disclosure dataset yet, but you want to be included in it, then of course you can complete the public disclosure assessment. You can also send us a contact form via our help desk system just to make sure that your entity is not included yet so that we don't create any duplicates. But other than that, it's completely voluntary, so it is not a prerequisite to participate in the real estate assessment.
Right. So to reiterate, we've collected the public disclosure information for almost 700 listed property companies worldwide. And so it is very likely that your company is one of them, and that information is already pre-filled into our portal. That is all based on publicly available data and is disconnected from the real estate assessment. So the two data sets are complementary. And again, to Christina's point, if you're not sure whether or not your company is captured, please let us know and we can double check for you. Right, then Charles, would you like to take over and talk a bit about the performance component?
Sure, can you hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Hi everyone on the line. This is Charles. Well, obviously a pleasure to do this live webinar with you today. I'm happy to manage to set that up, and I'm very impressed by the number of attendees. Actually, 120 is a very impressive number. I'm about to go through a few slides on the performance component, and would be happy to answer any questions regarding the performance components, of course. Well, from a structure perspective first, the performance component is divided into 9 aspects, as you can see on the slide. Most of them have to be reported at the asset level through the GRESB asset spreadsheet. We're going to go through the spreadsheet in a few slides. A few of them have to be reported at portfolio level, which means on an aggregate level, which means not asset by asset. And one of them, risk assessment, which is the aspect at the top, actually contains both indicators, are asset and portfolio level. If you remember from last year, we used to have an aspect called performance indicators. This aspect has actually been broken down into 4 sub-aspects or aspects respectively, energy, GHG, water, and waste. And as you can see on the slide, all indicators have been renumbered to match the aspect that they belong to. So for just to provide clarification there. Next slide, please. So what are the main changes that, in this component compared to last year? So, well, first of all, as Roxana mentioned earlier, when we're going through the main, the components of the 2020 assessments, the asset level reporting this year has become mandatory, which means that all participants have to report some section at the asset level. And these sections are energy, greenhouse gas, water, waste, building certification, technical building assessments, and efficiency measures. In addition to that, the concept of the last year concept of directly versus indirectly managed assets has now been replaced by landlord versus tenant controlled areas, but both concepts refer to the same notion really, which is the notion of operation control. And this notion was, fully aligned with the GG protocol. So the logic behind is not really different. It's mainly the level at which we have to define an asset. So we used to define just assets from managed versus indirectly managed. Now we classify assets as well as areas within an asset. And finally, the last point of this first section is last year participants were actually required to report either location-based greenhouse gas emissions or market-based greenhouse gas emissions. This year, all participants are required to report on the location-based emissions so that all the values that we collect are as comparable as possible and have the choice to report on the market-based emissions if they want. The second point here on the slide, oh no, sorry, can you go back? The second point on the slide doesn't really lead to any new requirement from your perspective as participants, but it's mainly on our side, where we actually integrated indicator R1.1, formerly called RC 5.1, into the validation scope. So if you remember from last year, if you're an existing participant, at least you remember from last year, you had to support your reporting boundaries by providing a supporting evidence in indicator RC 5.1. This year, a percentage of participants will be selected for validation, where the validation team will compare the portfolio boundaries reported in R1.1 and the supporting evidence provided. If material discrepancies are found between both sources of documents, GRESB may reach out to you as participants and require some clarification to be provided, or even potentially changes to be amended in the actual assessments. In the case of remaining material discrepancies between both, GRESB reserves the right to reject the performance component of the participants. That's very important. Now, just to clarify, the whole purpose here is not to find the one asset out of the 1,000 assets that wasn't being reported, right? The whole point here is to make sure that no participant is actually cherry picking and just reports, a substantially different scope than the actual scope of the company. And finally, the last point really, covers a few indicators have been either removed, such as ME2, or simply simplified, such as ME345 and PI 1.2, 2.2, and 3.2 have also been removed. Next slide, please. So these two last slides, are going to go through two main, changes that the asset spreadsheet was subject to. So the first one really is about how the spreadsheet was set up. The last year's spreadsheet was displaying one row per asset. We've changed that to actually display 2 rows per asset, or at least multiple rows per asset if someone wants to report on more than 2 reporting years. But the minimum amount of rows that you will find per asset will be 2, because the 2010 GRESB assessment requires participants to report on 2 reporting years, because in addition to simply calculate intensities for the current reporting year, we also track improvement metrics over time. That also better aligns with most of the data management systems out there, and finally allowed us to get rid of some of the information that we were asking you in the past. A good example is the last year's spreadsheet had a column that was asking whether an asset was subject to a change in data coverage. This is something that we can actually calculate ourselves this year. We don't need you to provide us with that information anymore, so it has been completely removed. And finally, this change only applies to some tabs within the spreadsheet, not all of them, because some other tabs, so the one not represented on this slide, do not require one value per reporting year, but just require one value period. And therefore, this change only applies to the 5 tabs shown on the slide. Next slide, please. Finally, the last change I wanted to talk about is about data availability. So you will see that all the key performance indicators have now 2 new columns that are called data availability, actually except greenhouse gas, because greenhouse gas is exactly the same as energy. And the whole purpose of this change is really to drive data quality overall, by allowing participants to add context to the performance data that they reported. Let's say you own an asset for 12 months, but you only have data for 6 months. Well, we need to know somehow that the data that you reported only covered a period of 6 months and not a year, okay? And obviously we're gonna use that information when normalizing metrics, and to better lead to better comparable metrics and overall better data quality. That's it on the performance components, but again, I'm sure there will be a lot of questions on that component, and I'd be happy to answer anything later.
Charles, thank you for that. Somebody has a question on the reporting characteristics tab of the asset spreadsheet. Does the acquisition date, owned since column, and disposition date for assets acquired or sold in 2019 need to appear in the 2018 and 2019 rows, or just the 2019 row? So the acquisition and disposition date, do they need to be reported for both 2019 and 2018, or just 2019?
So you're gonna have to fill that in for both years, because in some cases we're actually gonna look at, we're gonna actually compare performance from the last year and from this year. And therefore, we need to make sure that we compare apples to apples, and to make sure we do so, we need to track. We need to make sure that we know exactly what period a performance data relates to, and therefore we will need that information for both years.
Okay, thank you for that. Somebody had a question about the scoring system and the implications on scoring. We will not go through the details of that today, but we have published the scoring document on April 1st. So that is already available. You can already access it online. And that document includes detailed explanation of how each indicator is scored and how each indicator contributes towards the overall score and the aspect score and everything else. So if that's confusing, or there are parts that are unclear, then we can clarify them individually, but that document is a great starting point. All right. So we discussed management, we discussed the performance components. It's time to have a look at the development components and some of the updates here. Just a clarification. So this indicator tags, the numbers of indicators, they don't indicate all the indicators that were changed. This is just the number of indicators for each aspect to give you a sense of the scope of the component and how many indicators you can expect to see in each indicator, but in each aspect. But that doesn't mean that each and every one of them was changed in some way. We have also published a mapping between the 2019 and the 2020 assessments, so that you see exactly what was the tag of the indicator last year, what's the correspondent this year, and so you'll be able to do a comparison yourself and make the link between the two assessments. So, Kevin, over to you.
Hi, everyone. This is Kevin, and thanks for joining. I know those in Europe, it's getting late, so hopefully you've cracked open a beer at this point on a sunny day here in Amsterdam. Yeah, so as Roxana mentioned, the development component is to be completed by entities that engage in new construction or major renovation projects during the reporting year. So that means whether the projects were either ongoing or completed during the reporting year. So in years past, the content of the development component was in the previous new construction and major renovations aspect. So this aspect came after, I guess, the beginning of the real estate assessment. Last year we had, roughly 400 entities that completed this new construction and major renovations aspect, but you were really only receiving an aspect score, and the development component itself did not contribute to the overall GRESB score. So yeah, I mean, in terms of content, the development component is addressing the full building life cycle. So it starts with ESG requirements, looking at your general ESG strategy, then moving through materials, certifications, and some other requirements as well. So yeah, in terms of stakeholder engagement, we are addressing contractors, essentially those ones, working on site, and the community, and engagement and monitoring processes for those stakeholder groups. Next slide, please. So as with the management component, it was largely a structural change with the introduction of the aspects. So last year it was essentially NC1 through NC14 were the indicators, and they have just been restructured into the 7 aspects. We do have some new answer options for the existing indicators based on alignment work, as we mentioned, aligned with infrastructure assessments, other frameworks, and frequently provided other answers from years past. We did introduce new topics as well in the materials aspect, looking at life cycle assessments and essentially, what percentage of your portfolio has undergone life cycle assessments, and then the disclosure of embodied carbon as well. And this was alignment work with CDP's 2020 questionnaire. Next slide, please. Great, so here we'll look at the output and results of the GRESB assessment. So looking at the top left here, we have the GRESB real estate benchmark. So this benchmark is made up of entities with standing investments. So entities that complete both the management component in the middle as well as the performance component on the left will be part of the GRESB real estate benchmark. So the management component makes up 30% of that score, and the performance component composes the remaining 70%. Looking at the bottom right, so we have the development benchmark. So this is made up of entities that, yes, have new construction and major renovation projects, and is 30% management and 70% development. So in the case that your entity has both standing investments and new construction and major renovation projects, you will actually be part of both benchmarks, receiving 2 benchmark reports. That same management component score is applied to the respective benchmarks as well. Great. So I think that does it in terms of our general output and results. So Roxana, back to you.
Yeah, so Kevin, somebody had a question on the development component. If there are more than one project ongoing in 2019, do they need to report on all of them or select the one that is representative?
So in the case of having more than one ongoing project, you should report on essentially any projects that have begun the commissioning process. That can be as early, as design and owning the land. So yes, if you do have ongoing projects, you should just report on the full scope of your portfolio. And then, of course, if you do have completed projects in the reporting year as well, those should be reported.
Okay, and I suppose there is another question that I think is still connected to this. If a new asset comes online in the middle of 2017, there are 6 months of data in 2017, 12 months of data in 2018, and 12 months of data in 2019. How will like-for-like analysis work for that asset and for the portfolio? Well, actually, I think this is for the performance component.
Yeah, so let me pick that up maybe. So I understand that the question, essentially the asset is now reported on 3 reporting years. We're talking about 2017, or partially at least, 2018 and 2019. So the way we calculate like-for-like only looks at the comparison between 2019 and 2018. Eventually, it is true that we want to keep track more than 2 reporting years, but for the sake of the 2020 GRESB assessments, we're only looking at 2 reporting years, in the sense that we'll only compare essentially the 2019 versus 2018, and we'll disregard the 2017 values.
Perfect. Thank you, Charles. All right, there are a few more questions, but I'll leave them for the end, because right now I would like to hand over to Eric to talk to us about the resilience module, which is in its 3rd year. So,
yes,
Eric?
Thank you, Roxana. This is Eric. So the resilience module is in its 3rd year. This is a supplemental module offering that started in 2018, and so you can opt in to fill out this resilience module. You can also specify whether you would like to have the results shared or not. So the module, as you can see, had 2 primary goals. One, to meet the investor demand for information about the resilience of property and infrastructure companies and funds. The second of the 2 goals was to provide more information about the processes that property and infrastructure companies use to identify, assess, and manage climate-related risks. And so here, resilience would be the ability of an entity to plan for, to respond to, and to rebound from short-term shocks and long-term stressors. The module this year, we added 2 new indicators, so that brings the number of indicators from 8 to 10. And so can we move to the next slide? So the scope of the module follows the recommendations of the TCFD for the first 2 types of risks, first being transition risk, second being physical risk. But we also have a broader view of resilience than what is tackled by the TCFD. And so we also include an opportunity for companies to disclose on the social risks that they are tackling at the same time. So these social risks are still under the umbrella of climate-related risks, insofar as the social risks are those that are caused or exacerbated by transition or physical climate-related risk factors. Next slide. So one of the most important things about the 2020 resilience module is its increased alignment with the TCFD. So we have 4 aspects here outlined. So kind of 4 categories within which the indicators fall. And these align pretty well with the TCFD recommendations. And there's some overlap between especially the 2 central categories of risk assessment and business strategy and financial planning. The 2 indicators that were added this year fall under the business strategy and financial planning, although they spanned both the strategy and risk management components of the TCFD recommendations. So there's also increased flexibility in terms of the answers around risk factors identified, the potential impact of those risk factors, and how the organization is managing those risks. The module also gives more optionality in terms of more appropriate and specific scenario options that are used in the scenario analyses that companies use to assess their risks. And so that's it on the updates for the 2020 resilience module.
Great, thank you, Eric. Somebody is actually linking the resilience module and has a question related to this in relationship with the COVID-19. James Lee is actually saying that there are articles that link pandemics to climate change in a broader context. And obviously we haven't had a chance to really discuss this at length and evaluate with our governance groups. But to what extent do you think GRESB could link pandemics to the resilience module?
It's a really good question. The reason why the social risks in this module are so far only those with respect to climate-related social risks is because there are kind of common and well understood frameworks for how to disclose on climate-related risks. It may be that in the coming months and over the next year, COVID-19 will spur a whole bunch of kind of frameworks around how to disclose on pandemic-related resilience. And while there may be some, I guess, studies, I mean, there are always studies that can link anything to anything. Climate change and pandemics is no exception. That's not to discredit the legitimacy of those studies. But for right now, I would say, unless there's kind of a common framework for disclosing on pandemics in terms of climate change, I'm not sure it would fit under the guise of this module this year.
Well, obviously there's a lot to be researched here and a lot of work to be done. A lot of organizations are now looking into it and trying to address it as extensively as possible. So this is definitely on our agenda over the next months, and we'll proper engagement on the topic with our governance groups and with all of you, really. And in relationship to this, in fact, because there are a couple of questions that relate to COVID from other perspectives as well. We've also published a little survey in the assessment portal and on the website, and we can circulate the link after this webinar as well, that is meant to collect information and learn how you're dealing with this crisis, really from an operational perspective. To what extent is COVID impacting your data collection processes, your engagement with the tenants, with the property managers? To what extent is it blocking your capability of reporting to GRESB, but not only this year? And to what extent do you think it's going to impact your processes in your operations this year and next year? So if you haven't already provided your inputs there, we would love to hear from you. And we will also share that link a few more times with our newsletters, because it is important to understand what the general behavior is at the moment, and perhaps identify areas where we can work together and help by providing more information transparency. So thank you everyone. We have now about 15 minutes for questions, and we have quite a few questions still in the Q&A. If we don't manage to go through all of them today, as I said, we'll also share the answers afterwards. And actually, Eric, there's one question on the resilience module scoring. Will it be scored this year or next year as part of the real estate assessment?
That's a good question. So it will be scored this year, although you don't have to include that score in the core real estate or infrastructure assessments. And select indicators might be modified and then will be included in the core real estate and infrastructure assessments next year, starting in 2021.
And in fact, we're finalizing a separate scoring document for the resilience module as well. We plan on publishing that over the next weeks too. Again, the resilience module is a voluntary set of indicators. It doesn't impact in any way your assessment scores, but it's a good exercise for everyone to go and think of these topics in a structured way, because after 3 years of addressing this on a voluntary basis, as Eric said, we'll make a selection of what's mostly relevant and try to integrate into the core assessment to the extent possible and to the extent it makes sense. Okay, so let's now take a few more questions on all components and general ones. Where can the question mapping be found between the 2019 and 2020 assessments? We have a set of resources on the website. If you go to www.gresb.com, at the top you go to assessments real estate, and if you scroll down a bit, you'll see a list of resources. And this mapping is one of them. There's also the assessment in Excel version, something called the real estate score simulator, which is basically an Excel with the number of points associated with each indicator that allows you to see the impact of each indicator on the overall score, so you can actually edit the numbers. Perhaps it's a good way for you to sort of anticipate what score you can expect and things like that. A recording of this session will be made available. Somebody asked. Christina, would you like to take a couple of questions on the management component? Somebody asked something about the question on ESG objectives.
I'm struggling to find the question, Rox. Could you please read it out for me?
Yes, one moment. So in the question, does the entity have one or more persons responsible for implementing ESG objectives? What do you mean by core responsibility? How do we define it?
I saw it. I think that Kevin has already handled that, but maybe I can just reiterate. By core responsibility, we really mean the main responsibility. So this would be any employee that is a sustainability employee for the entity, or an ESG professional. So any type of ESG or sustainability specific staff would be one whose core responsibility is implementing ESG objectives.
Great, thank you. Charles, if we have a first-time participant that don't have 2 years worth of data and they only have 1 year worth of data, I assume it's the data set for 2019, can they still submit the performance component, and what is the impact of that on the benchmarking analysis and the scores?
Sure. So of course they can still submit. The only difference is that some of the metrics that we calculate and are actually used for scoring require 2 years of data, specifically the like-for-like changes over time. So we track improvements from 1 year to another, and to do that we need both reporting, both years of data, if that makes sense. So the only impact for these, if you don't have any data for the year before, essentially is that you will not qualify for these points relating to the like-for-like changes. Now, I just want to specify that it is only the case if there is, this is calculated at property type level, not at the asset level, which means that what I just said is true if you don't have any data for any asset in your portfolio which are part of the same property type. If you have some data for some assets within that property type, then some assets will qualify for the like-for-like change, and therefore will be able to calculate the metric to determine the score relating to that section.
Yes, this is a nice consequence, or a nice implication of the asset level reporting this year. Kevin, there's a question on the development component. If a company is involved in development projects, but this line of business is not part of its core business, is it obliged to fill out the development component?
Sure. And we've received this inquiry several times. And so in short, no. So GRESB is not requiring that entities complete the development component if there are development projects. Of course, this is highly recommended. If the entity considers itself both an operator of buildings and a developer, it very much makes sense to complete the development component. I think in terms of implications, if your investors are expecting you to participate in the development component and are expecting a score, of course you should proceed with that. And I think a benefit this year is, for the vast majority of entities that had previously completed the new construction and major renovations aspect, this year will be the first year where you can benchmark your performance relative to your peers and how you approach your development projects. So I think there's only an upside, and it's not a huge reporting burden to continue on the development component. But no, I mean, if you have one or two assets out of a massive portfolio and don't consider yourself a developer, it's not mandatory.
Thank you. Christina, does the portal automatically pre-fill previous year's responses, or do they need to be entered in manually?
Yes, that's a good question. This year, we have removed the pre-filling option compared to last year. And the main reason why we did that is due to the structural changes that we all mentioned earlier, we have essentially added new selection options to almost all indicators. And in order to ensure that participants don't overlook this or don't upload the same evidence that was there before, but select new answer options, which would then lead to their response being only partially accepted, we have decided to leave the pre-fill option for this year. But this doesn't mean that we don't have tools to help participants compare their previous responses to this year's. And namely, they can download their responses in PDF, their 2019 responses, where they can see all of the selections that they have made, as well as the evidence uploaded. And there is a live link to that evidence. And also the evidence library is completely filled with every single evidence that has been provided in previous years as well.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. As part of the same question, or the second part of the question relates to scoring of asset level data. So we'll continue benchmarking, and we'll continue scoring data at the portfolio level. We will not score individual assets in 2020. We will not implement a specific scoring methodology for each asset and benchmarking at the asset level. So the benchmarking process will work similar to previous years, and is also explained in the scoring document. So you will not receive scores for each individual assets. You will only receive an aggregate score for energy at the portfolio level, well, broken down by property type, similar to last year and previous years. Okay, somebody's asking, what is leader in the light? It showed up on the screen, the screenshot from the online portal. Yeah, Kevin, would you like to answer that? Would you like to pick that up?
Sure, I can start. So Leader in the Light is it is administered by NAREIT, which is basically the listed property association from North America. So if you were not a member of NAREIT, it would not make sense to participate with Leader in the Light. But it's essentially a set of questions that NAREIT uses to establish, I guess, some of their biggest market players. Yeah, I mean, Rox, do you want to add on to that?
Sure. So it's a separate set of indicators. It's managed by NAREIT. It's offered to its members, listed companies in North America, although there are some members that are globally established as well. And it's a competition that's meant to promote leaders and show good practice in the field of ESG, evaluate or showcase innovation and excellent examples of how some organizations differentiate themselves. It's it's a bit different from the real estate assessment because it is it's obviously more focused on the innovation elements and things that can't really be boxed and scored in a very strict and precise way, which is the case for the real estate assessment. So if you are interested, if you are a listed NAREIT member and you would like to participate, let us know, and we'd be also happy to put you in touch with our friends from NAREIT. Okay, we only have a few minutes left and many questions to answer, but we'll take a few more. Charles, still related to the asset data and the asset level reporting. The asset level data needs to be submitted, well, the data needs to be submitted at the asset level. And somebody's asking if it's not scored, how will we actually use it?
All right. So one of the biggest improvement actually this year compared to last year is that although we're not scoring asset level, it is true, we're using asset level for data quality checks. For example, GRESB developed an outlier detection system that was implemented at portfolio level last year, is now implemented at asset level, which means that for each asset, we calculate intensity values for energy, greenhouse gas emissions, water and waste, as well as like-for-like consumption change or emission change from one year to another. And we challenge these metrics against thresholds. The whole improvement compared to last year is that this is done at the asset level now, which means that for each asset you provide information for, the information for all the data points are actually going through go through these checks. So I think it essentially means that, in other words, last year we were able to agree with the subtotal or the total of a table. This year we're actually able to agree with every single line within the table, so the whole breakdown of a table as well as the total.
Okay, and to add to that, so this is a very important development and a very important step towards improved data quality and more checks and more quality controls and more transparency into the underlying data that was coming to us as a bundle at portfolio level until now. So from that perspective, it's a huge step in the direction of more specificity and more quality controls. But also, in the end, we want to put this data to good use and provide useful insights to you as the participants that actually go through the process of providing the data. And this process starts this year. You'll already receive and you'll already see insights or asset level analytics in your reports when you receive the results in October now. I would like to reinforce and emphasize the fact that all asset level data remains confidential to you as the entities that provide it. It will not be, the asset level data will not be shared with investors, will not be shared with other parties, will not be shared with anyone outside GRESB unless you provide explicit consent. So this information is used for improving the quality of analytics and starting to evaluate performance in its true sense, coming from the asset level, rolling it up to portfolio level. We started evaluating and started doing some calculations of intensities at within sectors at the country level in previous years. We'll refine those methodologies. We actually want to start working on methodologies that calculate that allow us to calculate energy use intensities and water intensities and carbon intensities based on the information you provide. And so it is an important step towards that direction where really the performance component is rooted into the performance of the assets, and that's based on the asset data that you provide. I note we're at the top of the hour, and so I would like to be respectful of everyone's time. I know it is the end of the day and towards the evening in Europe, and most of you will go and have dinner with your families. So thank you very much for dialing in. Thank you for joining us. I would also like to give a special thanks to our global partners, Evora and PwC, who helped us organize the in-person trainings that unfortunately couldn't take place anymore this year. But they've been great supporters throughout this process. And we'll follow up with all of you with the answers to the questions that we were not able to pick up today. There's a long list of them, and we thank you for that. And of course, now you know that you can always reach out. You've interacted with the people that will answer your questions, so we hope this opens the doors to a good dialogue this year. Thank you. Stay healthy, stay safe, and good luck and the best of luck with this year's reporting process.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.